All week I've been reflecting on Luke 24, which, I mean, the whole chapter is rich. And the section that you have on your handout is rich as well, with lots of things that are worth unpacking this morning. I just want to look at this question, because I'm just so fascinated by it. Like, why are you looking for why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He's risen. And there's something so profound about that question. And something so, I don't know, impactful about that phrase. He's not here, he's risen. And it's a question that I feel like is being asked of us this morning. Earlier I was thinking back to, I think that it was the summer of 2021. So my wife took our daughter to go to Cayman. So my wife is from the Cayman Islands. That's a whole other story for a whole other day. But we hadn't been back there, at least at that point, since March of 2020 because this little thing called COVID. It didn't really happen in Florida, but it was a thing at some point. COVID happened. And so part of the way that Cayman was handling it was like you could go or visit, but you have to be willing to quarantine for 2 weeks. And who in the world has just 2 weeks lying around to just sit in a house by yourself and do whatever? So they went during the summer. I couldn't go. I had other stuff going on. But I did meet up with them later, which meant I had to quarantine separately from them because they had already kind of done their time and I was on my own. And it was me alone in a house for 10 days with limited internet, which for most people sounds terrible. But me, I like being alone with my thoughts. Like, I actually can't tell if I'm more of an introvert or if I'm just a jerk, and that's what this is. But I was alone in the house for 10 days. So it meant I got to do lots of reading and lots of writing, and I worked out every day and listened to lots of music. I was living the dream. Like, Brittany and her sister had gone grocery shopping for me beforehand, so there were groceries waiting for me, and I just got to live it up. But there was one thing that I couldn't really figure out when I was in quarantine, and that was cooking. So it's not because I don't like cooking. I actually really enjoy cooking, and I do the majority of the cooking in the house. Anybody who listens to me will tell you that. So I actually do the majority of the cooking in our house. But for some reason, I couldn't figure it out. And people who like to cook, you know what it is. Like, you don't have the full access to your arsenal when you're traveling. It's just, all right, I got salt, I got pepper, and maybe garlic powder, and I'm gonna make do, right? Like, we're going really classy if I have cinnamon. And we're just gonna make do with what we have. And so I was in this place and I was making stuff, and I just remember it was maybe the morning after I'd arrived, and I made eggs, and I ate into the eggs, and I was like, this doesn't taste right. Like, something about this feels weird. At first it was just kind of like a subtle offness. I was like, okay, well, whatever, just keep eating. I'm sure it's just fine. And so I just kept eating, and after a certain point, I was like, no, this is really weird. And actually, I'm afraid that if I keep eating this, I'm gonna get sick. So I put it to the side. I was like, I'm not gonna worry about it. And I just kept making stuff, and it just kept tasting weird. Everything came out weird. And so I started looking at ingredients, is there something off with the eggs? Are the eggs expired? Is it something with the pan? Is it too much soap in it or something? What is wrong here? And everything was checking out. Nothing was weird. And so I said, okay, well, let me, I don't know, I guess I was like, well, if we're doing, an experiment, or if we're exploring options here, let me look at the seasonings. Let me see what's actually going on here. Do the salt and pepper that I have, is there something weird here? Are they expired? Is there something growing on them or what? And I looked at it, and it turns out, to my dismay, I did not actually have salt. I had a can of Morton's salt substitute.
Okay.
And I was like, salt substitute? I didn't even know that was a thing.
What demonic thing is that?
What is salt substitute? And so I was sitting there what is that? Like Splenda?
Right.
Splenda, it says it's not sugar and it has some sweetness, but when you're drinking a diet soda that's not sugar. Whatever is in this, it's supposed to imitate something that's something else, but it's not quite it. And so I was like, salt substitute, what? I started piecing it together, oh, I think this is what's making my food taste weird. And I was mad, mad as all get out, because I looked in all the drawers, I looked in all the cabinets. That was what I was stuck with. It's not like there was salt somewhere else in the house. It was me in quarantine, alone with my thoughts, and salt substitute for 10 days. And I was like, this is awful. I would not wish this on my worst enemy.
if you wanted to play a prank on somebody, like college students and your roommates, and you're like have a roommate that you don't really like all that much, replace their salt with salt substitute and watch what happens. Like you will learn a lot. You're welcome. I gave you something to do for your roommate. And so I was like, what? Who invents this kind of stuff? Like, why does this exist? And what it is, essentially, is that for some people who have high blood pressure, they can't really do the sodium thing. So, what salt substitute does is it takes out the sodium and replaces it with potassium chloride. And so, it's similar enough to salt to where if you're eating it, you don't really notice the difference. But if you have large quantities of it, it leaves kind of a bitter or metallic aftertaste in your mouth. So it may have looked like salt, and it may have even tasted a little bit like salt, but when you really got into it, you learned quickly that it wasn't salt at all. It was a substitute, a counterfeit. And as I look at that question of why are we looking for the living among the dead, is that not in some way settling for salt substitute when the real thing is right there waiting to be tasted and tried? Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He is risen. You know, earlier this year, I went to a concert in Orlando. I like music. And there was a group that I've been following for a couple of years, and they have never played a Florida show despite having multiple albums and being around for almost 10 years. They've never played Florida. And so this was supposed to be their first Florida show. And the second it was announced, I was like, oh, I am there 100%. Like, no questions asked, I'm going. And it was actually attached to this sort of political rally because a local politician in Orlando was running for re-election, and I guess he runs this music festival. And so I was like, okay, well, whatever. I don't live in Orlando. I'm not going to vote there, and I'm not really privy to any sort of political party, but I'll go anyway. And so I went, and because it's attached to this rally, of course, you know, right before the band goes on, everyone comes up, they make their speeches, they're talking about what their, you know, sort of their platform is. And it's fine. Like it's interesting to kind of be on the outside looking in, sort of analyzing it. But you know, of course, part of it is like because Israel and Palestine is such a big thing in the news right now. Like there's at the concert, at the festival, are these pro-Palestine protesters that like have their signs, they have flags, they're like walking around, they're chanting, they're marching, and it's fine. Like no one's really bothered by them in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I think everybody at the festival is expressing pro-Palestine sentiments. Like everyone's like, yeah, like we agree that what's happening to Palestine is really messed up and something has to change there. But then, you know, right before the band comes on, it's like they're chanting, they're doing their thing, and once again, nobody's bothered. But pretty quickly, the whole thing sort of devolves into almost like a case study of systems theory and like right out of Edwin Friedman book or something. Some of you have no idea what I'm talking about. You can look it up later. But what I'll explain is that essentially, so the band comes on and the group keeps chanting, right? So we're thinking at first like, okay, maybe they're just chanting until the band comes on. But the band is on and they're playing, and it's not like one person. It's like 20 people who are chanting their pro-Palestine chants, which the band is like, no, that's cool. Like, do your thing. Like, go free Palestine. Like, we're with you. And it just continues to go on. Eventually, police get involved because you're not supposed to have flags and signs at the event. And these people have flags and signs at the event. And so the police are trying to talk to the protesters, saying, hey, it's cool, you can be here, but we need your signs. But to the band, who can't really hear what's all that's going on, all they see is there's hostility between protesters and police. So then the band stops playing, and the band says, what's going on? And they start coming to support of the protesters and berating the police who are keeping them safe. Not great, but it was what it was. And then the band, you know, wanting to appear virtuous, is trying to talk to the protesters, hear what they have to say. The protesters are wanting to kind of get their message across, and the band is like, yes, we're 100% behind you, we're with you, and we support you, and we love the fact that you're protesting, do your thing. But then that's not enough. These people want to be on stage, and they want the microphone, and they want a chance to like berate the concert and everyone who's there. And the band's like, actually, we can't let you do that either because security. And so the band gets caught in this really weird catch-22 where either they play the concert and they're complicit in this performative act of solidarity, or they quit playing the show and disappoint everybody who came from all over the place to watch them play their first Florida show, myself included. And it's this really tense moment where they actually don't know what to do and they leave the stage. Like they leave the stage for a good 5 or 10 minutes to try to figure out what they're going to do, like what's actually the right way forward. And eventually they come back and they play a few more songs because they had a very tight schedule. And the band, the protesters are so mad. They're like cussing out the band. They're cussing out the concert. They're cussing out the people who are at the concert, and they march out. And I literally spend the next 2 hours on my drive home trying to process what in the world did I just witness? Like, was that even worth going to? Because I drove 2 hours to be a part of something I didn't actually believe in the first place, to have it be interrupted by some people who everyone already agreed with. And now, what was that actually? And so I'm sitting there and I'm driving and I'm like verbalizing, yelling in my car because that's what I do in my spare time. I yell in my car. And, essentially what it was is that everybody there was looking for the living among the dead. That's actually what was going on. That it's the protesters looking for the living one in platform and in power and in liberation by any means necessary. It's politics and the audience looking for the living one in their politicians and in policy. It's the band themselves looking for the living one in solidarity and in virtue signaling and in what is perceived to be justice. Everyone looking for the living among the dead, and all of it is salt substitute. All of it was salt substitute. Hints at something true and real and genuine, but not actually it. And if you had enough of it in large quantities, it actually left a bad taste in your mouth. I think about my gym and the amount of people I've met who look to Jordan Peterson or David Goggins as the ultimate authority on life. Stay hard. I think about the self-help world and its obsession with manifesting and crystals and vibes and the universe on one hand, and people who are just so fascinated by stoicism on the other. I think about subreddits and the championing of science and education and kindness and freedom as the solution to all of society's ills, the way that people look to Donald Trump or Andrew Huberman or even Taylor Swift as the one who's going to be the person who liberates us from our situation. And if it's not them, it's who they represent, what they represent. And all of it is looking for the living among the dead. And the reality is that we're not immune, are we? I mean, this is the story of Israel. Israel looks to David. It looks to Zerubbabel. It even looks to John the Baptist. Is this the future coming Messiah? Is this the one? And we as Christians, we might not necessarily look in all the same places at the world, but we do have places that we look for the living one among the dead, right? Like there are celebrity pastors. There are, there's a way in which we can fall into dead religion that is just sort of lifeless Bible study and spiritless prayer, and we think that's the living one. And all of it is salt substitute. And we have the living one right with us. The one whom the law and the prophets testified about. The one whom through him, all things were made, and without him nothing has been made that has been made. The one whom all of human history points towards and hinges on. The one who holds all things together in himself, the bread of life, the true vine, the good shepherd. And he died, but he rose again and is alive and holds the keys to death and Hades in his hands. Everything else is at best shadows to the real substance that is Christ Jesus our Lord. And because he is a living one, he does not stay with the dead, but he walks around and meets us on the road and in the locked rooms of our lives, inviting us to eat with him, to touch his hands and his feet, to hear how everything we've looked for has always been toward him. In the particular section of Luke that you have, Jesus doesn't make his appearance there. And yet later when he does, he's unrecognizable. On the road to Emmaus, it isn't until he breaks bread with those two men that they see him. When he greets the disciples later, it isn't until they touch his wounds that they know he's real. He's alive and walks among them, but they can't recognize him. And the question for us is, can we? Can we recognize the living one amongst us? Where are you seeing him around you? For all the things that I just mentioned, it's crazy to me the amount of people in my gym who I've met who are open to spiritual conversations with me because Jordan Peterson, who's not a Christian, mind you, says the Bible is true. They're willing to talk to me about it. They're willing to ask me about it. I think about my gym owner who's not a Christian and yet is begging for me to do more faith and fitness events at the gym because he sees value in it and sees it as an important thing that the gym should have. It blows my mind. And the fact that he and his wife are trying to have a kid right now, and what he's doing, because some woman overheard him talking to his dad about it and gave him a list of Bible verses to read over his wife, he's doing that. He's not a Christian, but he's like, I was told that if I read these Bible verses over you, we will be able to have a child. And so he's reading scripture over his wife. I have no idea what God is doing, but the living one is amongst us, drawing all people to himself, pointing to himself in everything. He's not with the dead things, but he is walking with us on the road of our lives, inviting us to commune with him. And in the same way that these disciples become witnesses to what is written, that the Messiah would suffer and rise again on the third day, our lives become witness, evidence to that reality, to the living one, in ways big and small. The fact that we were dead in our trespasses and sins, and yet God, who is rich in mercy, makes us alive again in Christ Jesus. But it's also the thousand little resurrections that we see every day, the way that friends who can be at odds with each other can find reconciliation with each other and stay with each other. That's a sign of resurrection in the living one. When it's college students who have nothing in common with each other, who, if you were to just see them on the street, they probably would not be friends with each other. And yet, because Jesus Christ has knit them together into something unique, they are a deep, profound community on campus. That is sign of the resurrection, of the living one around them. It's in the way Stacy Hester, who already has enough on her plate, opens up her homes to 2 foster kids. It's the way that Jim and Mary pour out their lives for Lakeland and have ingrained themselves in a homeless community that has seen its own crazy leadership transition, and they've been a stabilizing force in the midst of it. I see it in Lindsay Carr's joy and compassion, who somehow has found the balance between that and just having a crazy sense of spine and decisive leadership. She is not afraid of anything or anyone as she walks with men in recovery. I think about the humility of the Diaz family. I think of all of you, and each one of you, your lives demonstrate submission to the living one. And it's evidence to his resurrection. Imperfect as we are, witnesses all the same. Testaments that he is risen, and that one day all things will be made new. I was thinking about that this morning when I was driving over. What's crazy about the resurrection is that this monumental thing in the course of human history has happened, and the rest of the world is asleep to this reality. It's like the sunrise, essentially. It's a slow dawn of a new day, of new creation coming in. And even as I'm driving this morning, thinking about the reality that, man, that dawn is becoming brighter. It's dawning more on us. This new creation that is flowing outward around us. And each of us are acutely aware of the ways that we still need the living one to dawn in our world. In our neighborhoods, our workplaces, schools, classrooms, family, finances, friendships, we still need the living one. In the court system, in the foster care system, in Israel and Palestine and Ukraine and Russia, we still need the living one. Even in our own weary hearts, we need him. And the resurrection fills us with boldness and hope that the one who kept his promise to die and rise again will keep his promise to come back again. And his words are trustworthy and true. Can we hold on to that this morning? You know, most of you know that I have a daughter. She is going to be 4 in June, Naima, which is crazy. I don't know where time is gone. My phone will send me like little videos because iPhones do that where they just kind of send you memories. And it's crazy to like look at her as like an 18-month-old and to think about the near 4-year-old I have on my hands. And it's just wild. And most of you know Naima, she's a character. And kids, they get obsessed with all sorts of things, right? So for a while, it was CoComelon. Thank God those days are over. God is real. And then it was like Bob the Train and all this other stuff. But maybe most recently, the big obsession was this show called The Octonauts. How many do people know about The Octonauts? Okay, yeah, y'all know about The Octonauts. And so The Octonauts is this really interesting show where it's these animals who I guess are committed to exploring, rescuing, and protecting other animals and the environment. And so they explore, and it's really an educational show. So when she first started watching, it was way over her head, and it still is. Like it's kind of over my head a little bit too. But there's these animals, and they kind of explore the world. They save animals, and they have like a little song that kind of sum up the episode or whatever. And so maybe the most beloved character on that entire show, although there are some great characters, is this character named Quasi. And Quasi is a cat. He's a kitten. But he's not just like your average kitten. He's like a pirate cat. So what's not to love about a squash-buckling pirate cat that goes on to save creatures in the ocean, right? So he is daring. He's a little quick-tempered. Like he's very impatient with kind of other newer animals, and he's always kind of posturing himself against people. If I had to compare him to the disciples, he's definitely Peter. Like that's Quasi 100%. But Nema just absolutely loved Quasi and loves Quasi, like to the point where she like had her like Care Bears, and she picked her yellow one and said, "You're Quasi." Like named him Quasi, and like everywhere was like, we got to take Quasi with us. And like had a unicorn, and for whatever reason decided the unicorn was also Quasi. And then when she was like playing by herself, we'd be in the kitchen making stuff, and we'd hear her talking to her imaginary friend named Quasi. And then sometimes we'd ask her like, "Oh, who's Quasi?" And she'd say, "I'm Quasi." And so we're like, what is happening? Like she was obsessed with Quasi. And so Christmas comes around, and we say, okay, well, what are we going to get her for Christmas? Like, I don't know. Like my brain is spent. By the time the holidays come, I've got nothing left to give to anybody. But we start looking online, and of course, Amazon has Octonaut plush dolls. And of course, there's Quasi. And we're like, oh, this is golden. Like, let's get her the Octonaut. She's going to be so over the moon. She's going to love this. And she'll, like, have a real Quasi instead of all the, like, fake imaginary Quasis that she has. And so we give it to her on Christmas. And she's super happy, overjoyed, plays with it for all of 3 seconds, decides, nope, I like my other Quasis better. And so even now, Quasi is in her room covered with stickers for who knows what reason, but she has all these other versions of what she calls Quasi in her life. And it's ridiculous. But as I think about it, it's not as ridiculous as the ways that I substitute the real Jesus for something else, for something less. It's like even as we talk about looking for the living among the dead, I'm aware that I also am guilty of it. Maybe I don't look for it in politicians or in platform. I have no interest in those things. But I look for the living one in the approval of other people. Thinking, okay, well, something about your words, your wisdom, you are where the living one is. And guys, you are the salt of the earth. Don't get me wrong. But in comparison to Jesus himself, it is just salt substitute. I'm sorry. And I've found that no matter how much approval I get from whoever I'm looking for it from, it still doesn't satisfy. It's still not enough. I'm still, at the end of it, just not quite happy with it. I need the living one. I need to hear his voice and to know what he's saying to me. Because in those moments where I have it, where I have a deep sense of the Father's love for me, of Jesus' like heart towards me, even my own insecurities about myself do not matter. Actually, I'm so taken by him and by his love for me. When I'm in the presence of the living one, none of it matters, not even my own judgments about myself. There is life and wholeness in him. And I want to be someone who holds on to the living one, who builds his whole life on him, who is unswayed by the winds and the waves of life, because I have found the one who gives life to all. And I want that for you too. I want that for you too. The morning, the call is actually very simple. It's to stop looking for the living among the dead. He's not there. He is risen. And he beckons us to leave behind the grave and to experience life and fellowship with him. What's the salt substitute that you need to walk away from? Where do you need to stop looking for the living among the dead? Now I'm going to wrap up, and in a few minutes we're going to have an extended time of worship. But this, as we enter into that worship, maybe that's it. That, like, as we're worshiping the risen one, we are also making this transaction in our hearts and maybe even vocally, like in our prayers, that, like, God, this is the thing that I'm holding on to. These are the ways that I'm looking for the living among the dead, and I am giving that to you, and I want you, the real living one, instead of what I'm holding on to. Can we leave behind the dead to join the living one this morning where he is? Can you hear his invitation to you? Why do you look for the living among the dead? He's not here. He's risen.